Talking Florida football, it was a strange season for the Gators. They break through against Georgia. They win the big battle there to an Eastern Division championship in Dan Mullen's third season. So from that standpoint, and through 9 or 10 games, everything looked good. I'll say 9 games before the LSU game. And certainly they were in line to win the SEC, possibly compete for a college football playoff. They had the odd incident with the shoe throwing against LSU. They play Alabama really tough in the title game and then have this complete meltdown, but minus half the team against Oklahoma in the Cotton Bowl. So how does a Gator fan feel about this season? Because there were breakthroughs and triumphs, but it didn't end real well.
I don't think we've all gotten over the LSU loss. I think the Alabama game made us feel a little bit better. The Oklahoma game sort of poured salt in the wound again. And the LSU game is really the one that everybody's going to look back at, not only because of the thrown shoe, but because LSU came into the swamp severely hampered, missing a lot of their guys due to COVIDs and opt-outs and injuries and all sorts of stuff. A true freshman quarterback starting on the road in the swamp. Granted, you don't have an environment there because you don't have fans in the stands. At the same time, it's your own home stadium. You got to win that game, and you get an opportunity to play Alabama to go to the playoff. And they blew the opportunity. And it was sort of eerie with the fog coming in, and they, a missed field goal at the end when they could have tied it. So, you can tie it to that tied shoe, or to the thrown shoe, but the shoe sort of exemplifies Florida's season, which is that they found a lot of different ways to shoot themselves in the foot, particularly on the defensive side of the ball, when they had a team that at times looked like it could be a juggernaut and be up there with anybody in the elite. And, the reality is that it's a missed opportunity. And I think people at Florida recognize that the offense was good enough to potentially win a title last year, or at least make the playoff, and they just weren't able to do it because the defense could never get things together. So, that LSU game sticks in everybody's craw. The Oklahoma game, okay, like it's a bowl game. They didn't take it seriously. I don't think people liked that happened, but they're willing to forgive that one. The Alabama game, everybody lost to Alabama, so that's not a big deal, or at least it's not a deal breaker. It's the LSU game that everybody just looks back at and says, ugh, like that's the one that we shouldn't have lost, that we should have been able to win, and it really would have set us up to where you don't come into the offseason coming off of 3 straight losses and just the momentum, the negative momentum that brings.
MarkRogersTV, the voice of college football. If you enjoy the content here, please hit the like button and check out the videos. If you are joining us for a first time or have only sampled some of the content, I think you'll like it. And if you do, of course, subscribe, hit that bell for the notifications. That way you know when we're going live. Talking Florida Gators football, we got Will Miles on the line. Join him and David Waters over on Gators Breakdown. And also, if you love classic games and just looking back at classic games and enjoy the discussion like I do, I can get lost on YouTube for hours looking at classic games. Then please join Will on 2020 Hindsight on iTunes. Dan Mullen, much like his team this year, you can go either side of the fence in terms of whether he triumphed or whether it was a bit of a failure in spots, because the Georgia win was enormous. Breaking through in the Eastern Division, getting to the SEC championship game. And even though it was a loss against Bama, they performed against Bama better than anyone on the schedule and even up to the championship game. On the other hand, you had the buffoonery of, well, some people would say of the Darth Vader incident and the Missouri game and the comments made after the Texas A&M game. The crowd noise distracted us, and it was difficult to call plays. All sorts of things that he said, and then it all comes crashing down in the Cotton Bowl. When a lot of excuses were made about this not necessarily being our team, and we played our last game against Alabama a couple of weeks ago. I think, Will, that people know what the deal is in college football now, that there are major opt-outs. And when you see Kyle Pitts and Kadarius Toney and basically your entire wide receiver core out and defensive starters out, that people would understand, okay, they either lost to Oklahoma or they put up a fight and they barely lost, and so we're going to give them kind of credit for that because we understand what the deal is. I point to North Carolina. They gave Texas A&M a game, and they had all sorts of starters out, their most productive offensive players, and people came away from it saying, they put up a fight and they lost, but we understand that they were missing some of their best players. But Dan Mullen just seemed to not handle that situation well.
Yeah, I think there are plenty of people in Gator Nation who didn't really appreciate the way that he handled that situation. And And then he's also sort of doubled down on his defensive coordinator, who Gator Nation also particularly has some ire for right now. And so there's some fences to be mended. Now, the only thing I would say is that this is who Dan Mullen is. It's who Dan Mullen's always been. Like, he's always been somebody who has been maybe rough around the edges. He's always been somebody who's been very, very stubborn when it comes to the types of decisions that he makes, and not just at Florida. He was like that at Mississippi State. And if you go back and read Buddy Martin's book about Urban Meyer's time at Florida, there are actual quotes in there where, like, they kept Tim Tebow away from Dan Mullen because they were afraid that he was going to convince him to not come to Florida. And so there are some personality quirks. He's a quirky guy. And the Darth Vader stuff, I think there are people who thought that was funny. There are people who, after, he had sort of participated in increasing the temperature maybe of the fight that was going on the field, didn't think that was a wise move. I think most of us thought that probably wasn't a wise move, but that's what you get with Mullen. You get a guy who's an offensive savant. You get a guy who is not really a huge recruiter, and you get somebody who is going to do some of these quirky things from time to time. And the question is, does the ability on the offensive side of the ball, particularly for a program that up until Mullen came back couldn't score points against anybody, is that the ability on the offensive side of the ball enough to offset the other things? And is there anybody better coming down the line? So it's been an interesting offseason because you mentioned all the things that happened during the season, but then right after the season, there were all sorts of rumors that he didn't really quell about having interest in NFL jobs and things like that as well. So there are some people who've been rubbed the wrong way, and I suspect there will be some fence mending that has to happen. But at the same time, part of that NFL talk was angling for an extension, and once that extension gets signed, everybody apologizes and makes up, and then everything's good. And the reality is that his first 3 seasons at Florida have been pretty comparable to Steve Spurrier and Urban Meyer, and much better than Will Muschamp, Ron Zook, Jim McElwain. And so the positives far outweigh the negatives. And we also haven't seen spates of arrests and different things like that as well. And so, not winning a national championship every year. I mean, they've won 3 in the last 30 years. It's not always going to happen. But having a consistent program that's fun to watch, it's interesting to watch, I think Mullen provides that. And so I suspect he's going to have quite a bit of rope from the administration so long as he doesn't continue putting them in situations that are uncomfortable.
So will his savant status on the offensive side is going to be challenged here in 2021 minus Kyle Trask? Emory Jones comes in. His passing opportunities limited, of course, in the game time that he's gotten. The wide receiver core is gutted. Just your thoughts about the offensive side of the football in 21.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a completely different offense, obviously. I think one of the things that you hope to see, and I think Florida fans should expect, is the offensive line is going to be a lot better, both because they have an extra year of experience, but also because the guys they've recruited, they probably recruited for a dual threat quarterback, and Emory Jones certainly is that. I mean, he averaged something like 6 or 7 yards per carry over his career thus far, even though the defense basically knows he's running the ball. And so if you're getting 7 yards a pop every time you run it, that's going to make a big difference when you drop back to throw, when that's an actual threat. And up until now, most defenses have just not treated that as a threat, and they're going to have to, and they're going to open things up, and he's going to throw. He's less accurate than Trask, but he's a heck of a lot more mobile than Felipe Franks. So I think what you're going to see is probably sort of a hybrid in the offense where they rely much more on their quarterback running game, but that's going to open up a lot of other things where the windows are much wider than they were for Trask, because oftentimes Trask was throwing into very tight windows because Florida couldn't run the ball.
Yeah, it was pretty astounding, the lack of a running game, because a couple of years ago, they were the one team in the nation that had a perfect divide between running and passing in terms of total yardage. It was like a perfect split. And then they wanted to continue to achieve that. But I know that Dan Mullen said at one point, hey, we would love to be able to balance it out, but if you can't do it, you can't do it. We're going to do what we do best. And they just said, caution to the wind, we're just going to chuck it, because that's what we do well. And here they are with a completely different personnel setup here for 21. So if we look, Will, at the defensive side, Todd Grantham, as you mentioned, much to the ire of a lot of fans, is back running the defense. How does the personnel look for 21?
Yeah, it's going to be really young. This is a transition year. You've got, Kyer Elam at cornerback, but Jason Marshall, the 5-star cornerback who committed to the 2021 class, probably going to get an opportunity to start on the other side. Rashad Torrance and Trevez Johnson are safeties who are going to step in. They're losing pretty much their top 4 defensive backs. Not that their defensive backs played all that well in 2020, but they're losing those top 4 guys. And there wasn't a whole lot. There was a lot of consternation in Gator Nation because they weren't bringing in some of the young guys to get them a lot of reps. But we saw what happens when they brought in those young guys for reps against Oklahoma. And so the good news is that we're probably back to a normal schedule next year where they'll get a couple of games that aren't SEC games. They'll be able to open up, I think USF's on the schedule and Florida A&M. So they'll open up with a couple of teams where they're able to make a few mistakes and still make up for it. But the big thing is they've got a couple of transfers at defensive tackle who've come in because defensive tackle is really, really, really thin. And Gervon Dexter is really the only guy who'd gotten any real playing time there. Slayton's going to the NFL. Kyrie Campbell's going to the NFL. And so they couldn't stop the run last year either. I mean, they couldn't stop the pass, but they couldn't stop the run. Having a couple of transfers at defensive tackle, I think, makes that a little bit more solid. But I'm expecting the defense to improve off of what it did in 2020. I don't think we're expecting this to be a top 10 or top 20 defense. I think kind of run-of-the-mill average defense is what Florida fans are looking for, and Mullen's going to have to do yeoman's work on the offensive side of the ball again if Florida's going to be competing with Georgia and Alabama.
Will, is there a apprehensive type of approach to 21 from the Florida fan base, thinking that they've not necessarily eclipsed Georgia, but that 2020 might have just been an aberration and Georgia's going to take it back over?
Sure. I mean, I think JT Daniels played pretty well towards the end of the year. And you had Georgia fans sort of get up on their high horse there towards the end of the year about how well Daniels was playing. But, I mean, he played way better than Stetson Bennett. And so I do think Georgia's offense is going to be at least serviceable. It may not be outstanding, but it's going to be a defense. Florida's defense stopped Georgia's offense last year. So when you put it in that context, you're like, all right, they were pretty bad last year. So they're going to have a better offense. But Georgia's losing a lot of guys on defense, too. And so, this is one of the things about college football, and really one of the things about the differences in the programs is I think that when you look at their records, I think Dan Mullen, for the most part, usually gets the better of Kirby Smart in terms of on-field coaching. But Smart's always got more talent. And so it's always a question of who wins out. And last year, Florida had the better quarterback and the better offense, and so they were able to pull it out. The first couple of years, Georgia had the better quarterback with Jake Fromm, and so they were able to pull it out. I think it's going to be interesting to see, is Emory Jones able to be good enough to compete with JT Daniels, and is JT Daniels able to take a step off of what he did the last 3 or 4 weeks of the year where they weren't necessarily playing the most difficult competition. Florida and Alabama are going to be more difficult opponents for Georgia than JT Daniels has seen thus far. Is how he played against Cincinnati emblematic of how he's going to play all next year? If so, I think Georgia's going to be pretty good. And I think, Florida fans are probably a little bit apprehensive with all the youth that's coming in 2021. I think most fans who are realistic about the program look at 2022 and say that's where we need to target in terms of getting, let's make sure we get all the young guys experience in 2021, win as much as you can. But at the end of the day, it's the experience that you get that'll lead you into 2022 and make you successful.
Will Miles, Gators Breakdown. You can join them with it's Will and it's David Waters right on Gators Breakdown on YouTube or on your favorite audio platform. And also Will's classic college football podcast, 2020 Hindsight. Catch it on iTunes. So, Will, we appreciate you stopping by.
All right. Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.